Okay, so we have the guest speaker today, Dr. Catherine Menon, and I'll hand over to you, Catherine. So please do start whenever you're ready.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. As Andrew said, I'm Dr. Catherine Menon. I'm one of the lecturers here at University of Hertfordshire. And I'll be talking to you today about an ethical assessment framework called EHAZOP, as you can see, Ethical Hazard and Operability Study. Just to give you a bit of background about myself, my research and teaching interests are in human-centered computing, and one of the things that I'm looking at is the ethical impact of systems which include AI, or systems which are informed by AI, and which specifically are going to be used or going to impact members of the public. So throughout this, I wonder if I could ask you all a favor. Can you please not type anything in the chat unless you're alerting me to some problem that I can fix immediately? If, for example, the slides stop displaying or my sound goes away or something like that, if you can let me know in the chat. You can also use the chat and the Q&A to ask questions related to the content. So if you haven't understood something I've said, or you want an example or an explanation, please do put that in the chat or the Q&A. If I could ask you all, please, don't put anything else in the chat. Now, the reason that I'm asking that is because the chat will scroll very quickly, and Andrew is monitoring it as well as I am, but we will miss things if a student's trying to alert us to a problem, if my slides have stopped sharing, or a student has some question about the actual content. So please don't put anything in the chat so that I can look out for those students who have questions or who have any problems to do with the actual content or would like any more explanation. So as I said, I'm going to talk to you today about an ethical assessment framework. You have already come across several ethical assessment frameworks or frameworks for estimating the ethical impact of technology upon people. This is another one. It is known as Ethical Hazard and Operability Study, which I will abbreviate throughout to EHAZOP. You will see that written in a lot of documentation. This is relevant to you both in terms of your practice as software developers, your practice as software engineers, your practice as responsible technologists. It's also relevant because your tutorials next week will be focused on EHAZOP. You'll be performing a small ethical assessment yourself using the EHAZOP framework. And of course, the assessments will take this content into account as well. So any questions about the content as we go on, please do feel free to ask me or put them in the Q&A or in the chat. All of that will be fine. So to begin with, I know you've all been studying the ethics of technology, the reasoning behind responsible technology. You're all old hands at this. But nevertheless, let's take a little step back and say, why do we care about the ethics of technology? Now, ethics, responsible technology is arguably a field that's gained more prominence recently. If you go back to the 1990s, people were more interested in the technical capabilities of technology than necessarily in the human interaction of those technologies. But now, ethics, ethical assessment, responsible technology design is a very, very big thing. And why do we care about it? Firstly, most obviously, we care about it because technology can help people. So the most obvious example of this is probably medical and social technologies. So here's some examples of them. On the left, that little device is actually a pacemaker. So that gets implanted into someone's body and helps their heart keep functioning. Next, we have an MRI machine. Next up, we have a companion robot. So the robot, the little creature on the right, on the left, sorry, not the right, the creature on the right is a person. On the left, we have Pepper, who is a robot we've actually got here at the University of Hertfordshire. And Pepper is used to help people who are living with frailty or people who may have difficulty communicating, may have difficulty socializing, in interacting and gaining that sense of companionship. And obviously on the far right, we have a very technological looking wheelchair. So technology can help people from a medical perspective. It can also help people educationally. So obviously all of you are sitting there on your laptops watching this lecture. You wouldn't be able to do that without technology. So educational technologies include things like the VR headsets that we've got there on the left. We do have these again at University of Hertfordshire. So again, people who are interested in any of these, the technologies exist in real life. They exist in your university. We have, next along, we have some automatically generated British Sign Language captioning. And to the right, we have a technology that's used at University of Surrey, actually, to help their engineering design students. And finally, we have ethics technology which can help people to get about. So you've all taken transport that has an immediately updated bus timetable. Some of you may have been on self-driving buses. If you haven't, get out and get on one. They're fantastic and reasonably safe. So technology can also help people move about. They can help people access wider society, particularly for people who have challenges or obstacles. So for example, people who have accessibility challenges might find things like a technology-enabled timetable or a technology-enabled bus system to help them, able to help them overcome those limitations. As well as technology to help individuals, we also have technology that helps societies. And this is where we will be looking most intently at the ethical assessment of these types of things. So on the left, we have a satellite, which is used for weather reports. It's used for phone signals, probably a low Earth orbit satellite looking at that. So it will be used for things like GPS. We have in the middle, we have a picture of a drone that's used to help farmers, that's used to survey their crops, which obviously can help contribute to food security. It can help address food deficits or difficulties in predicting what the harvest, what the crop might be. And on the right, we have a picture of a drone that is overflying a tank, which is obviously something from the military domain, which in terms of how this helps society can contribute significantly to global stability and to addressing some of the ethical issues that can come with conflict and with conflict-related activities. Now, in particular, that image on the right should be setting off, perhaps I won't say some alarm bells, but it might be making you think that actually, along with helping people and societies, technologies like this also present the potential for harm. So clearly, military systems are an obvious example of this. So we all hear a lot of information about drones, about automated weapon systems, things like that. And those aren't the only, that isn't the only sector for which technology, which is intended to be helpful, can present potential for harm if it is not designed and deployed in accordance with responsible technology practices. So there are two types of harm that technologies can present to people if responsible practices aren't followed. The first is probably the most easy to understand. It's safety harm. Safety harm is physical harm. So, for example, you could pick up your laptop and drop it on your foot. That's compromised your physical safety, that's caused you physical harm. Obviously, transport technologies, things like that can cause safety harm. But it's also possible for technologies to present the potential for ethical harm. Ethical harm is compromise of ethical principles. Now, ethical harm can encompass, and usually does encompass, so it includes safety harm, because obviously causing physical harm to someone could be seen, depending on the circumstances, as unethical. So ethical harm arguably subsumes the category of safety harm. Now, obviously, from the perspective of responsible technology, we want to make sure that our technologies are not just benefiting people, benefiting society, but also, in addition to this, that they're not causing harm. And these are two separate things, as we're going to discuss in the next couple of slides. In addition to that, much more pragmatically, addressing these sorts of responsible technology practices is or will be part of your job. So as programmers now, or when you graduate and get a job, you will be required to adhere to certain codes of conduct. Now, many of the engineering and computer science bodies have codes of conduct. So the most obvious ones, which you will have come across already, are things like the BCS Code of Conduct, RAEng, which is engineering, Royal Academy of Engineering, IEEE, IET codes of conduct. So breaching these codes of conduct as a technology practitioner is a breach of your responsibilities within that role. So this is why we care about it as well. Now, as I said, there are a number of different ethical assessment frameworks which are currently in use. So I understand you've already covered some of them, even in this module, and there are many, many more out there. Almost as many as there are standards, in fact. You can choose which one you want to use, which is beneficial, but there are pros and cons. So part of the decision, before you even begin to think about the harms or benefits which technology could, your specific example of technology, could be presenting to society, you also have to think which ethical assessment framework is most appropriate for use in this particular situation. What do I know about the system? What role does the system perform? How advanced is the system? Is the system in deployment yet? And all of those questions will determine what ethical assessment framework you use. Now, for the rest of this lecture, we're going to specifically discuss AI-informed systems. So that is systems which make use of AI in some way. So this is the basis of EHAZOP, which is that it's used for AI-informed systems. Again, we see the type of question that you'll need to ask. You need to make sure that you're considering before you perform ethical assessment. Now, with all ethical assessment, with all ethical guidelines, with all approaches to responsible technology, there are two major types of approach. The first of these is principles-based, and a principles-based approach says what a system has to do. It provides good examples. It says the system must comply with this principle. You can think of it as a parable or a series of instructions. It's telling you how to design a responsible, a good system. As you can see by the little chap on the right, with his angel wings and his briefcase and tie, he is a designer of a good system. He's following or embodying a principles-based approach. Now, principles-based approaches are really common. So you will find principles-based approaches used in probably, I would say, most high-level strategic documents. So things like the OECD recommendation on AI, the EU AI Act. Largely, there are some different approaches in there. But largely, every high-level strategy tends to be principles-based. When you hear a prime minister, a president, something like that, talking about recommendations for the country, they will probably be speaking of a principles-based approach. And in accordance, there are ethical assessment frameworks which follow principles-based approaches. So some of you who've been reading on this subject might have come across PRAISE, which was developed at University of York. So principles-based approaches are reasonably common. But as I've said, they are high level. They are at the political level rather than specifically at the engineering level. So along with them, to complement them, we also have hazard-based approaches. Now, hazard-based approaches say what the system must not do. So they identify all the bad examples. So here we've got the symbol of a little chap with a tie and a devil horns. He's the bad example. So hazard-based approaches say what the system must not do. The system must not behave in a certain way. The system must not make a certain type of error. The system must not degrade in a certain way. And hazard-based approaches tend to be much closer to the way we design and develop systems as engineers. One example of a reasonably high-level document, actually, which makes use of hazard-based approaches is one of the British standards, which my understanding is you all will have access to via the library. So please do ask the LCS if you would like to see a copy of this, and they will be able to help you log on and get that. And this standard is British Standard 8611, which is a standard for the ethical design and assessment of robots. And this identifies the various hazards, the various pitfalls that the system must not fall into if it is to comply with responsible design practices. And as before, there are frameworks which take the hazard-based approach. And one of these is EHAZOP, which we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of this lecture. Now, those of you who are from a safety engineering background might be thinking this sounds very familiar, and you will be right, because all of this holds true for safety also. So ethics and safety are really very intertwined, and this hazard-based versus principle-based division is also there within safety. Now, that is quite important, that's quite illuminating, because EHAZOP, to give you some general background on it, is actually based on safety assessment. So EHAZOP is a technique that comes out of the UK Ministry of Defence framework for safety assessment. So the Ministry of Defence are obviously using a lot of technology with the potential to cause harm. So weapon systems informed by technology or surveillance systems. And they have a very rigorous framework for safety assessment, which makes use of something called HAZOP, or Hazard and Operability Study. Now, HAZOP has been around for many, many years. It's a technique that I believe was used in the oil and gas industry initially back in the 1980s, 1970s. The most recent standard, which describes HAZOP, Hazard and Operability Study, is from 2016. They keep updating them, and that's British Standard 61882. So again, you can go and look that up if you want to know some of the background to EHAZOP. Now, HAZOP, and by extension EHAZOP, consist of a collaborative and highly structured team process under a nominated facilitator. So the team will work together to identify each component of a system that they've been given using the system specifications. And for each individual component of that system, they will systematically consider all possible deviations from design using the predefined guide words that they've been given. So this is a process, as indeed EHAZOP is, which has a lot of preparatory work. The team will use guided discussion techniques to assess the results of the possible hypothetical deviations for potential harm. Could these cause any safety impact, or in our case, any ethical impact? And then they will record the findings before moving on to the next component. So what they will do is they will consider every possible way for every possible component that the system may not perform in the way that was intended by the designer. And this is really important to understand, because nobody sets out, most people don't set out to define, to design a system which is unsafe or unethical. These compromises of safety and ethics creep in. Essentially, they are the result of flaws in some process. And what we want to know is, could these flaws introduce any harm? So EHAZOP extends this essentially collaborative, structured process to ethical assessment. So EHAZOP, as with HAZOP, makes use of a set of structured and predefined guide words. That's important. We're going to be talking a little more about that on the next slide, on deviations from design and use intent. Now, you might notice a slight difference between EHAZOP and HAZOP. So HAZOP looked at deviations from design. EHAZOP extends this to look at deviations from design and use. And the reason for this is, as I said, EHAZOP is a technique used for public-facing AI-informed systems. Public-facing means that you will have people using them who might be children, who might be elderly, who might lack capacity in some way. And so you have to consider the possibility that they're going to use your system differently to how you intended. And some of these guide words might include things like more, less, early or late. And from a very high level, the team must apply each guide word in turn to each system function to see whether any ethical hazard might eventuate from this deviation. Now, an ethical hazard is defined, we like definitions in this module, in this lecture at least, is defined as anything which is likely to compromise psychological and or societal and environmental well-being. It is pretty broad-ranging. It covers pretty much everything that could cause ethical harm, from something such as invasion of privacy to distress, if someone is distressed by using a particular system, to something which might not cause individual harm, but may cause societal harm, such as entrenchment of bias or entrenchment of stereotypes. Now, part of the challenge of performing EHAZOP, as indeed of performing any ethical assessment, is that estimating the extent or the degree of harm, of ethical harm posed, is inherently subjective. So this is not the case when we talk about safety. When we talk about safety, we talk about injuries, about categories of injuries, about fatalities, and these are objective, these are numbers. But when we talk about ethics, we have to remember that the ethical impact that the system has is going to be different across different demographics. So one person might find that using a system is distressing, whereas another might find that actually they're not distressed, they're not anxious, their ethical safety, their ethical integrity has not been harmed in any way by that system. So this is one of the challenges of EHAZOP, this necessity of stepping outside ourselves and of identifying whether or not any of these systems could be causing harm to someone who isn't exactly like us. Now, I promised that we were going to come back to these ideas of the predefined guide words. And as I said, the guide words are defined before the EHAZOP process starts. So the guide words are provided to the team beforehand. Now, coming up with the guide words is arguably the most difficult part of EHAZOP. So the guide words are specific to each eHAZOP application, and moreover, they depend on the system. So they'll have to be defined each time for each individual system. So this is not something which can be reused, and it means that you have to be aware when you're creating these guidelines, these guide words. You have to be aware of what your system's capabilities are. So in other words, if you don't know what your system is going to do, you don't know the ways in which it might deviate from the designer's intent, or the ways in which people might use it, which are deviations from how the designers envisaged. So defining guide words, I would say, is arguably the hardest part. You have to do it. It's specific to each system. It's specific to each eHAZOP application. And you need to have a deep inherent knowledge of the system. Fortunately for you, you will not be asked to do that in the module. So if we move on, you can see that this is the overview of eHAZOP. So on the left, we have the overview of HAZOP taken from British Standard 61882. And on the right, we have the translation into eHAZOP. So you begin by identifying what your system is that you're going to look at, who's asking you to, what's the system you're examining. You need to have some idea about that. And at this point, you also need to identify who will be the facilitator. Now, this is important because when you come to your tutorials next week, you'll be dividing into groups to perform an eHAZOP, and someone will be nominated to be the facilitator. Now, being the facilitator is a very rewarding job. It's also challenging. So it's essential to nominate a facilitator who understands the system, understands ethics. They basically have to be an expert in ethics and in the specific system. Once you have an idea of the system and once you have an idea of the facilitator, you then move on to identify what functions the system actually performs. Now, the efficacy of your eHAZOP application is going to depend on the extent to which you have a detailed system specification. Obviously, if you only have a very high level perspective on what the system's going to do, you can't really say what happens if it doesn't conform to the designer's intent, because you don't know in detail what the designer's intent is. At this point, this preparation point, you also identify the guide words, the deviations that the team are going to use. And then finally, in the third box, well, not finally, the penultimate box, the third box down, this is where you actually perform your eHAZOP. So this is where you assess what effect could occur if each deviation happens in each function. You determine whether you think this effect could cause ethical or safety harm, and you determine whether or not the team agrees on the potential for harm. So in your tutorials and in your module, you will only be asked to do this step. You won't need to, in fact, you will need to define a facilitator, but you won't need to define the system. And although recording your findings is essential, in fact, for preserving traceability and for providing assurance that you have adequately ethically assessed your system, this won't be part of the recordings that we take within the module. So, as I said, you will be given, when you perform an eHAZOP, a set of structured guide words. They are very highly structured, almost restrictive, some people would think, on deviations from design, use, and intent, such as more, less, early, late. And those are applied in turn to each function of the AI system in question to explore potential effects. So what does that mean in detail? That means for each function, you need to ask a what-if question. And then the question is, what if that deviation occurred? What ethical hazard could eventuate? So the two most immediately interpretable ones are, what if this function happened early? So what if the user encountered this function earlier than the designer was intending, or earlier than the user was expecting? Or alternatively, what if the function occurred later than the user was expecting? They're expecting a system response sooner, or the designer wasn't expecting that particular function to occur until later. So those ones tend to be reasonably easy to interpret, but the value of eHAZOP and the challenge of eHAZOP, they go together, lies in the interpretation of the more abstract guide words. So, for example, the guide word more. So the what if question you're then answering, thinking about is, what if this particular function happened more than the user was expecting? And you think, well, how could I interpret more in that specific example for a function? And you might think, well, it could be that the one interpretation might be that the function is happening continuously and the user only expected it to happen once. Then you would say it's happening more. And you might assess that scenario to say, well, is that causing any ethical harm? Perhaps you might interpret it to say that the function is operating more widely than the user expected. So it's operating on all the data that's available to it. And the user or the designer only expected it to be operating on a subset of that data. So if it's it might be operating, for example, on everybody in the room, if it's an AI system that is aware of people who are within that room, whereas the user only expected it to be applicable to themselves, perhaps. Perhaps it might be that it is being executed more, as in it is happening more often. So it's happening more than just the once, or it is happening to a different degree. So the user is perhaps not aware of the extent to which it's happening, the perhaps even the time that it's taking, the resource processor, the resource that is devoted to it. So you have to interpret in as many possible ways what could be meant by more. So in other words, you have to come up with every possible way of interpreting that guide word that you can to assess that specific what if question to determine whether or not any ethical harm could be caused. Now, as you can see, or hopefully you can see, eHAZOP is all about creativity. So eHAZOP is a technique that really makes use of creativity, of debate, discussion. It's been likened to lightning in a bottle, which is basically it's when you get the right people together and they start thinking outside the box. Now, because of this, debate and discussion is essential. So as we said before, the value and the challenge of ethical analysis in general lies in being able to understand what ethical hazards might be faced by someone who is not necessarily you. So if someone has anxiety, for example, might they view this system in a certain way? If someone is from a demographic that has been marginalized in some particular way, might they have a different experience of the system? If the system is designed for people within a specific demographic, might it unintentionally be regarded as potentially entrenching discrimination against that demographic, or perhaps even mirroring our own subconscious bias in the way that it's been trained and the way that it operates. Now, because of this central role played by debate and discussion, the role of the facilitator is critical. So the value of eHAZOP lies in the ethical hazards and the interpretations that are suggested which people don't agree on. So if everybody interprets and only asks the obvious questions, you will get a very superficial hazard, ethical hazard assessment, which goes without saying. And the facilitator's job is to help people move outside that. So the role of the facilitator is really critical. And it's important to understand that there is no clear right answer. So you can't get this right or wrong in a sense. And in particular, there's not necessarily any clear traceability between guide words and hazards. So if you were to say, well, what guide word is used to identify what hazard? I would tell you it doesn't matter. The importance is that the hazards have been identified, and the importance is that you have followed due process and you will be able to demonstrate that, which will be necessary to demonstrate that your system has been adequately ethically assured. In other words, you're able to demonstrate that you have taken all necessary and sufficient precautions to ensure that your system is not going to pose any ethical hazards to people. So in that process, it doesn't matter whether you use one particular guide word to identify a specific hazard or whether you used a different guide word. The importance is the debate and the discussion around that hazard. Now, as with most things, once you graduate, I'm sure you're all aware of this from your lives outside the university, apart from your assessments, when you actually design systems, there is no metric or rubric. So there is no way of knowing when all hazards have been identified. You can't say, well, here I've provided a checklist and you can see that all the hazards have been checked off. This is because different systems will present different hazards. So there's no way of knowing that you've identified all the hazards. And because of this, the integrity of your ethical assessment rests on the expertise of the team. So it's important to make sure that your team fully understand the system in question, that they are, as far as possible, experts in ethical assessment or in ethical understanding, and ideally that your team is sufficiently diverse. Now, this can be an issue. Historically, a lot of software development is designed by, software development has been performed by people from quite a narrow demographic, so university educated, generally well educated, quite often white or male, for example. And this means that the systems that they produce have been historically designed from the perspective of that demographic. So the important thing when you conduct ethical assessments is to make sure that you're assessing those systems from a number of different perspectives. Now, EHAZOP is much easier to understand when you look at specific examples. So in the last segment of the lecture, that's what we're going to do. So this is an example of an EHAZOP that we conducted on an assistive robot. So you can see a picture on the right. An assistive robot is a robot which lives within your house. So it will come and it will operate within the domestic environment, and it will do things like provide some generalized, very high-level medical guidance. It will provide companionship. It will provide some physical guidance and monitoring. It will help you perform tasks such as answering the door or making sure that the oven is switched off. These tasks which are essential to continue to live independently in your home. So assistive robots are used primarily by demographics who would otherwise not be able to live independently. So people living with frailty, people who are elderly, people who face certain physical or mental challenges in the activities of day-to-day life. We looked at a specific robot. It's a CareRobot. It looks very much like that one on the right there. And we nominated 3 functions. Now, these are all functions which an assistive robot can perform. So this is not science fiction in any way. This is not hypothetical. These are all functions which can be performed by assistive robots now. Just worth mentioning that. And function one, first function, at a specified time, the robot will remind the user within the home to go and take some medication that they need to take at that time. So this is a quasi-medical function. The robot is telling the user that they must perform some activity in order to remain healthy. Function two is that the robot will monitor the user's facial expression throughout the day while they're going about their day within the home. And if they detect from the user's facial expression that the user may be lonely or sad, then the robot will offer to set up a video call with a relative. So the robot will ask the user, would you like me to set up that call? And then it will, if it receives a confirmation, it will go ahead with that. Function three. So we know already that the robot can monitor. That's part of the job of an assistive robot. And if an interval has gone past without the user engaging in any physical movement, if they've just been sitting down on the sofa for a certain specified interval without moving, without getting up, then the robot suggests that the user engage in a sequence of guided stretching activities, which it monitors and provides feedback on. Now, as I said, all of these are existing functions for an assistive robot. We did not invent any of these functions. So these are functions of technology which is in practice today. So when we performed the eHAZOP, these were the guide words that we used. Now, these guide words we sourced from quite an extensive and diverse demographic. So obviously the team of researchers here in the computer science department at University of Hertfordshire took part in this, as well as the manager of our robot house. So we do have a house that has assistive robots like this in. If you are interested or want to see it, then please make sure that you use the forms, the Microsoft Office forms, where you can register some interest. And next time we run an experiment there, we can contact you perhaps to take part in the experiment. And if you do, you can come and see the robots, see how they work. So we involved the researchers on the project, the managers of the robot house. We also involved people who were architects, so people who design the houses where the robots are going to be used. We involved software engineers, and we even, for this, actually involved some creative writers. So we took this problem to a group of creative writers, and we said, can you help us come up with some guide words? Now, obviously, in creative writing, choosing the right word, the word with the most possibilities for interpretation in this case, is important. So they were able to assist us with that. And we've come up with these guide words, more, which we've already discussed, where this specific characteristic or function of the robot is in some way greater or increased from that expected by the user. So all of this is from the user's perspective now. Does the user consider that they're encountering any ethical hazard? Less, obviously, opposite of more. Early, as a guide word, means this characteristic or this function of the robot is encountered earlier than the user might expect. Late is the opposite of early. We also have opposite, where this characteristic or function of the robot is the opposite of that expected by the user. Now, this is important because we've this, along with different, where a specific characteristic or function of a robot is different to that expected by a user, is something that we've all encountered. So you have a new app on your phone, or you go to a new website or something, and it tells you to do something, and you think you know what's going to happen when you do it. But actually that button doesn't do that, or that setting does something else entirely. So we've all encountered that. And it's particularly ethically relevant when you have an assistive robot within your domestic space, especially if you are in some way disempowered and you're relying on that. We've also got the guide word in addition, where a function is performed in addition to the one that the user was expecting. So perhaps the user is expecting the robot to monitor some physiological signal, perhaps their blood pressure, and the robot does that, but it also transmits that information to the doctor's office. Now, the user may not have been expecting that. So the robot is meeting its functionality, but it's doing something else. And this may present an ethical hazard. And never, which is where the user expects a particular function to be performed, but the robot doesn't. Now, here's some examples of ethical hazards that we identified by applying these guide words and the functions we identified them from. Now, we haven't identified which guide words we used to come up with each of these ethical hazards. Remember, that's not important. What is important is the identification of the function and the hazard. So for all of those functions that we've described, there is a potential problem or potential ethical hazard because all of those require monitoring of the user in some way. So the first function, the robot has to find the user at a particular time and remind them to take medication. Well, it can't do that if it's not monitoring them, if it can't find them. The second function was where the robot was monitoring the user's expression and determining if they looked lonely, in which case it would set up a video call. And the third function was where the robot was monitoring if the person had been sitting still for too long, and then it would offer to take them through some exercises. So all of these potentially risk compromising the user's privacy because the robot is monitoring them within a domestic environment. And interestingly, all these functions also have the potential to present the ethical hazard of dehumanization, which is where the user begins to see the robot as an authority figure. So normally when we think of technology, we think of us being in control. So we think of it being us who design it, and the technology does what we tell it to. But in this specific example with the robot is giving advice, giving recommendations, giving, in a sense, instructions to the user about what they should do and what's appropriate. So there is a risk that the user is potentially going to be subject to compromise of human dignity, which is one of the human rights, in that they are now being subjugated to the robot. They could start to see the robot as being in charge of them, as an authority figure. Now let's look at these specific functions. So function 1, this is where the robot reminds the user to take medication. This has the potential to present the ethical hazard of inappropriate trust or deception. And the reason for this is that the user may extrapolate from the robots giving them this quasi-medical advice, that the robot will be able to facilitate wider medical activities. So the user may think, well, the robot is doing something that normally a human doctor or nurse would do. They would tell you to take your medication on time. So that must mean, the user would think, that the robot can also perform wider medical activities. So they may, for example, be expecting the robot to monitor their heart rate, their blood pressure. They may be expecting the robot to monitor the calories within their food and tell them when something is out of range. And obviously, because the robot does not do that, it only performs those 3 functions we saw, this means that the user has outsourced some part of medical monitoring and medical health to a device which is not performing that. So their health could be compromised. Their safety could be compromised. Function 2 is another example of dehumanization. So the ethical hazards can present in multiple ways, and you will see the same ones coming up again and again via different routes. So with this one, this is where the robot monitors the user's expression, and if it thinks the user is depressed or lonely, it offers to set up a video call. Now, this has the risk of encouraging the user to potentially begin to consider that their own facial expressions are problematic. So some people, when they're sitting there, when they're concentrating, maybe working on something or watching TV or relaxing, some people may have a very immobile face. They may not look particularly happy. They might even look depressed or look very withdrawn. Now, this doesn't mean that they are in fact lonely or depressed, but because the robot is constantly interrupting their activities and saying, I have detected a potential problem with your facial expression, the user could come to consider their own facial expressions problematic. And this is an example of dehumanization, where a fundamental aspect of the person is again being subjugated to the robots, to the designer's ideas of what is and what is not acceptable. And function 3, an example of one of the ethical hazards we found there was loss of human autonomy. So function 3 is where the user has been still for a while and the robot notices this and suggests they engage in some guided stretching activities. Now, there is the potential, if the user comes to rely on the robot for this, that they will cease to recognize their own body cues for exercise. And this is particularly true for people living with frailty or living with specific physical challenges, where they may, for example, no longer recognize that pins and needles in their leg signify that they should get up and move. Or alternatively, they may lose the ability to confidently perform those activities without the robot monitoring them. This is an example of loss of human autonomy as well as de-skilling. So de-skilling is where a human loses the ability to perform a task because it has been outsourced to an AI too often. So as I said, these are just examples. The list of ethical hazards is very long. If you're interested, you can find the paper, came out earlier this year. And you can see there's obviously a much wider list. And we took this into schools, for example, and asked school children to identify ethical hazards, to perform the eHazUp. Because as I said, one of the imperatives when you're performing eHazUp is that you make sure you have a diverse team. So why not include school children? They were very good at it, in fact. But not all systems are this simple. Now, by simple, I mean easy to understand, easy to conceptualize. Assistive robots are embodied, so there's a physical body there that's moving about. They perform functions that we all recognize and know. It's very easy for us to understand what they're doing. If you want to come and take part in an experiment when we run them, you can even come and see the robot performing those. It's very easy to recognize those systems and to interact with them. But not all systems are that simple. And next week in your tutorial, you're going to look at a system which is arguably, I won't say more complex, but it is more abstract. And this is a pedagogical system. So this is AI use in a pedagogical system, that's a teaching system, an educational system, that's used within a very specific domain which poses its own unique safety and ethical hazards. And the pedagogical system, the teaching system, is wargaming. So for those of you who don't know what wargaming is, for those of you who do, if anyone here is a wargame designer or something, what's on this next slide will be something you already know. Please bear with us. But for the rest of us, a wargame, as defined by the Ministry of Defence, is a scenario-based warfare model in which the outcome and sequence of events affect and are affected by the decisions made by the players. So that basically means that a wargame is a game, clue in the name, where the players will play out a hypothetical conflict. So they will take different roles within that conflict. They will take turns to determine what their specific role will do. The roles often correspond to countries. So in this particular conflict between 3 or so countries, each player will decide what their country will do on each turn, how they will respond, what factors they will need to consider. War games can come in many different types. They're usually not physical, so it's not, people don't actually go out into a field and physically try and fight or anything. But they can be computer-based, which is where AI will often come in. They can be quite low-tech. So in the picture here, you can see they're obviously playing something based on cards. They've set up a little screen so that this chap on the right can keep what he's doing secret from the other two. And they're playing out a hypothetical conflict, or a conflict which might occur. Now, why are they doing this? How is this a pedagogical system rather than just people having fun, basically? Why is the MOD pouring a whole lot of money into teaching people, into helping people like this play war games? And the first is that it is just that, it's educational. So these people, people on the right potentially, are people who, if a real conflict occurs, will be the people who are making the strategic decisions. So not the people who are out, digging the trenches or whatever, but the people who will be deciding what weapons to use, where to attack, what to do, what actions to take, what diplomatic, what policy actions, what kinetic or force actions to take. And the war game gives them a chance to learn about the effects of those in a specific conflict without actually having to go and declare war. War games are also used to predict outcomes or sequences. So a war game might be used to say, if there were to be a particular conflict, so if one country were to invade another, what would be the outcome of, for example, using a particular military weapon, using a particular type of tank versus another? So they can be used as an analytical role. They can be used to inform us about behavior. And here, the more realistic the war game, the better. So we might think, oh yes, if there were a war, I would do X, Y, and Z. But when you're placed in a scenario which approximates that of a real war, these commanders in this picture may very quickly find that they don't want to take those actions. So for example, they may decide to deploy a certain weapon, but when they're actually placed in a scenario which is similar to that, they may decide, I don't want to deploy this weapon because it would risk civilian casualties, for example. And that is something that perhaps they wouldn't necessarily have realized until they got into that scenario. And it also helps identify relevant conflict factors, including things like diplomatic or political factors. So, for example, one player playing a particular country may decide to respond to a move in the game by imposing some tariffs on goods, by saying, well, within the game, my country is going to restrict the export of certain weapons or certain minerals which you need to make weapons. And in that case, that is then potentially a relevant conflict factor. So war games are basically preparation for war. And because technology is advancing, because everything is moving on, war games will often not be designed or play like the picture on the right anymore. Instead, they are starting to use AI within wargaming. Now, there are lots of ways you could use AI, and we'll be going through some of these in the tutorial, but basically you might use AI for game design. So you might use it to play through your game. AI tends to be much quicker than humans. Humans might take an hour to play through your game and say whether or not it was balanced, but an AI could do it very quickly. And if it's not balanced, can tell you that. Now, as I said before, in a war game, people will typically take the role of certain countries. Now, to do that, they need to know something about those countries. So if you're going to take the role of the UK and predict what the UK would do in a conflict or play the UK in a hypothetical conflict, you must be able to say certain facts. You must be able to be in possession of certain facts about the UK. So, for example, you would need to know its political priorities, the other nations that it has historically allied with or been at odds with. You would need to know its position on tariffs and exports. You would need to know its military strength. You would need to know the extent of domestic support for hypothetical conflicts and the potential allies that might be overseas. And game design can use AI for generating the procedural content. So for generating all this information about the UK so that you can give that as an individual player briefing sheet to the UK player and say, that's what you need to know about the UK. War games can also, AI can also be used to simulate other players in a war game. So obviously not if you're using these cards and physically there. But if you're playing over the computer, it can be used to actually take the role. You can use an LLM like ChatGPT to take the role of one of the players and make the moves in the war game. So perhaps ChatGPT will take the role of the UK and it will pretend to be the UK throughout the war game. And you can also use it to provide decision support to players. So the players might be human, but they might be relying on AI to, for example, explain some the likelihood of success in a particular conflict, or to predict whether or not something would be against the laws of war. So now that we've looked at how you might use AI to perform an EHAZOP, looking at AI in wargaming, as I said before, the first thing is to define the guide words. So in this case, for your tutorial, the guide words will be looking at the different ways that you might use, design, and encounter AI, and how those might contradict the intent of the designer or the user. So some of the guide words that you will be working with next week include things like the guide word replace. So replace is asking you to consider what if an AI were used to completely replace a human that's performing a certain game design activity. Support is if the AI is used to support a human performing the game design activity. Secret, for example, is looking at the scenario, asking you to consider a situation where the full extent, perhaps even that AI is being used at all, is unknown to at least one person in the war game. So at least one person, for example, might be playing against an AI, but they might think it's a human. And the secret guide word asks you to consider whether or not there could be any ethical harm or ethical hazard that eventuates from that. Deception, obviously, would be the relevant one there. And the guide word open, where full extent of AI use is known to all humans playing the war game. And what you need to do in your tutorial next week is then, within your EHAZOP teams, focus on questions like, what ethical harm could eventuate if AI use in simulating other players was secret? In other words, if I were playing the war game and one of my opponents on the computer was ChatGPT and I didn't know, what potential ethical harm could eventuate? You'll be, EHAZOP might throw up a question like, what ethical harm could eventuate if AI use in content generation completely replaced human writers? In other words, if you fired all of your human writers and you said, I'm just going to use ChatGPT to come up with the information about the different countries. Similar questions, what ethical hazard could eventuate if AI use in playtesting were used to support, to help a human designer? And what if AI use in simulating other players just completely replaced those human players? What if you said, you know what, we could replace one player with ChatGPT? Why don't we just replace all the players with ChatGPT? Now, there are other guide words. There is more information about this, which will be provided in your tutorial. These slides and a recording will be available on the module homepage. So please do make sure that you review the slides, that you rewatch the recording as necessary, and that you have fully understood eHAZOP before your tutorial. So thank you very much to everyone here. Thank you, Andrew, for letting me give the guest lecture, and thank you to everyone for taking part. I'll just go to the chat now, as I think we have a couple of questions. I'm going to start at the bottom and work up in oh, sorry, yeah. Andrew.
I was just going to say that's sensible. I think there are the questions are later on. There was one question from Shiraz, which is how does the OECD recommendation on AI help in making AI systems more ethical?
Oh, fantastic question. Okay, that's a really good question. You can access the OECD recommendations yourself, but basically it identifies a number of principles that include things like inclusive growth and sustainability. That's saying that people who are involved in the design, development, and promotion of AI should ensure that it enhances human flourishing, so that it contributes to diminishing human inequalities, so that it contributes to the sustainable development goals. As you can see, as I said before, principles-based, a really high level. If you're an engineer and someone says, how do you make sure that you're contributing to human rights with this program? It's really hard to do that. So principles-based approaches are tricky. The OECD also includes things like principles based around transparency, based around explainability. So this is getting a little more relevant to us as designers, whereby the systems we develop must be transparent. So when the AI makes a decision, it must be able to explain how it's come to that decision, critically in a way that the end user will understand. So the OECD is saying, actually, you can't just spit out the results of a model checker, because the end user, the general public, won't necessarily understand that. You have to identify who within your system, who within your process, is accountable. So if you are a designer or developer of an AI, it's essential that you understand, according to the OECD principles, how far your accountability goes. If there is any breach to anyone's human rights or their legal standing, it must be clear to the person who is accountable for that breach. And the answer, by the way, is not, oh, well, it's the AI that's accountable. So a machine is never the accountable actor in any set of principles or any legal situation like that. So it is worth going to have a look at the OECD recommendations. As I said, when you do, you will find that they are unhelpfully high level. They contain a lot of really good things, but things where it's not immediately obvious how you would translate that into design level decisions. So fantastic question.
Thank you. And then there's one observation. The WALL-E movie shows the side effects of function 3.
Gosh, does it really? I haven't seen WALL-E.
I think, if memory serves, I mean, Sazid, if you want to elaborate, but from memory, I think it's all the humans are on a spaceship, basically doing not very much, being served by robots. So it's kind of they're totally, yeah, it's taken away their autonomy to a large extent. They're just kind of.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, well, I should watch that movie and start using it as an example. Thank you very much. That's a really good example. I will use that.
Great, thank you for confirming that. Yeah, exactly. I was really struck by that, because I actually did see the film, and thought it was the environmental catastrophe was the main thing, but then you see where the people are, and it is really interesting what they've
Oh gosh, I
done with
need to
that.
watch more movies.
That's a cartoon, to be fair. So I mean, it's like, but it is quite delightful in places. Anyway, we are slightly moving off the topic, but thank you for that. It's a pertinent point. Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm just going to post the link. I know that members of the group here are posting their interest in um, studies with the assistive robots, so we'll pass on details to you. And thank you very much for your questions. Thanks so much, Catherine, for providing the lecture. We look forward to working through eHasop in the lectorials next week. In the meantime, yeah, see you then.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for allowing me to take up one of the lecture slots for this module. And thank you to everyone for engaging with it. And I hope you enjoy and find the tutorials next week educational. So thank you to you all.
Thanks. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just if you wouldn't mind, just I'm going to share my presentation. I'm going to do it in slightly in reverse, just to give a break from the lecture format just for a second. I appreciate that some members of the group have their hands up for questions. Please, could you post them to the Q&A and I can follow up with Catherine with your questions afterwards. So really, I'm going to come back to that. But what I wanted to do was, it's also a bit of a change of pace just for a little while. We have a survey running just this week, and it's really important because it enables us to adjust the module based on your feedback, and that's what we're collecting here. So if you have the opportunity in the lectorial this week already, if you've done it, then fine, you can sit back and relax for 5 minutes or so. If you haven't done it, you will have a chance if you haven't been to your lecture, you haven't had your lectorial yet, you will have an opportunity there as well. But now's a good opportunity just to complete the survey. It's very short. It's 5 questions and it should take sort of 5 to 10 minutes to complete. And basically, it's something that it's information that's really valuable to us in the teaching team, because we can then, like I say, adjust the module where we need to. And we will update you with what was said and what we've done. It is anonymous, so please don't worry about being identified in the answers you give. And we are monitoring the feedback as it comes in. So please do make sure you do complete the form. It is really valuable for us, and we hope it will enhance the module for you as well. That last statement, I'm sure we don't need to remind you because we are in the responsible technology module. So I'm sure the comments you make will be respectful and professional. And so this is how you can actually participate. So I'm going to also post the link to the chat, so you can follow it there. But you should be able to click on I'll just to be sure, I'll put it in the chat. Okay, so if you could let me know if you can access that from the link. So it should just be a login, and then you'll be presented with all the modules you're studying right now. If you could just focus your time here on 7Com 2001, Responsible Technology, that would be appreciated. Okay, so I'm going to give just five or so minutes for that. Just it's a short survey, so please do fill it in. And if you don't fill it in right now, if you could do so in either the lectorial, if you haven't already done lectorial, and of course you can do it whenever it's convenient to you. You don't have to do it right now, but it's a good moment to do it. It's and I would encourage you to do so. Oh, okay. Um, try something else. This is going to be the same URL. Is anyone able to actually use the form or thank you? Okay, I'll report that back. Great, thank you very much. Thank you. It really does make a difference. We will be able to uh, adjust the module. You'll also have seen a request for when you want to when drop-in sessions would be the best for you, given some choices. So please do complete that as well. But that's we can come back to that later. So basically, we are trying to adjust the module to make it more to make the best educational experience we possibly can. And this survey is going to be really valuable for that. Thank you. So if you use, I'll share that again. So you can use the QR code as well. And just a reminder, it is anonymous. We won't know who said what. So please feel free to be candid. So if it might just be that if you filled them in, then they won't appear in your list. Thanks, Abhas. Yes. Yeah. So a lot of you will have done them already in the lectorial, and that's great. So this is just another opportunity. Okay, just a couple of minutes more. It's almost like a Mentimeter, but with the time allocation. This is awesome, everyone. Thank you. So what I want to do now is go through just the brief overview of the assessment. So some of the assessments are not yet visible. They'll be released at a certain point, and then you'll be able to start them. But others you will have access to already. Let me just. And just a reminder, if you are interested in assistive robots and you'd like to sort of maybe participate in a study or see one more up close, then please do use the module form to register your interest. We'll collate all of those responses and send them over to Catherine. Okay. Thank you for the pointing out the errors Tuesday. Someone else has also pointed out it shouldn't have been a requirement for Tuesday, so it is no longer required. So Tuesday should have just been another option, but it was said to be required by but it shouldn't have been a requirement. So now it's an option. So we will be obviously very cautious about what the results for Tuesday. We won't assume because it had the most votes that it was the most popular. And looking at the responses so far, we will be able to find a slot that's convenient for as many people as we possibly can. But I understand Tuesdays from now on, the Tuesday vote is optional. But before today, I appreciate that just because there's lots of results for Tuesday, it doesn't mean that Tuesday's the way it's going to be. Okay. So just to give an assignment overview, like I said, some of them you can't see just yet, and there's a reason for that, and that is because they are unseen. Because you're not. It's part of the assessment is that you respond over to an unseen scenario, so it's not just opened up for weeks and weeks. You need to you have a bit less time to study the scenario. And the reason for that is we need you to see the assessment once you've done the lectorials that are relevant, so then we can release the assignment and you can start. But also because, like I say, the part of the assessment is in how well you respond to a question, which you have a more limited period of time. You still have a considerable period of time to complete it, but it's not open for weeks and weeks. So this is the case with independent critical analysis. It's 30% of the module score, and it will be available from the 31st of October. And then you'll need to submit your responses, your submission by the 10th of November 2025. So it's an individual assignment, and please do when the briefing is released, the full briefing, please do study it and make sure you understand how you can use generative AI and so on, and also that you understand the what's being asked of you. So basically, the preparation for the assessment is just making sure that you attend the lectures and the in-person lectorials, and then complete the tasks in them. So there isn't sort of specific preparation other than just attending these sessions and doing the work. And remember that when we present work in the present tasks in the lectorials and indeed the lectures, the expectation is that you are also carrying on that work outside of timetabled sessions. So the work, there is more to do than you can complete in one lectorial, and the intention is you carry on that work outside as well. And of course, you can ask any questions on the discussion or via the module form if you have any further questions outside of the lectorials. So for the independent critical analysis, you're presented with a scenario, a brief scenario, and you'll be asked to respond to 3 questions relating to the ethical and professional issues that the scenario raises. And you'll be given directions in terms of the analysis techniques or approaches you're required to adopt for each question. So you're not just told do an analysis, you're told use this to do the analysis, use use this approach to do the analysis. And you have 3 questions to respond to. And like I say, the full briefing will be released on the 31st, and you will have the ability to, you'll be at the end of the 31st, and you'll be able to then start on the assignment at that point. So basically for that assignment, it is open book in the sense that you can use existing resources on Canvas and online. The usual requirement applies, so you must cite and reference any resources you use. And critically, it's an individual assignment, and you mustn't involve anyone else in your work in any way. So there are two main pitfalls other than academic quality of the work. The two main ways in which students cause themselves problems on this assignment. One is copying, not copying, but working with other people, and or using generative AI, both of which are quite obvious is probably too strong, but it is really quite clear when it's happened. So don't think you can sort of leave it and then rely on generative AI to do the work for you. You can't. So basically, when it's released on the 31st, have a read through. It's released in the evening, so you can just have a read through of the briefing, and then you can start work. But you've got plenty of time to finish that work. But like I say, don't leave it to the end of that week to complete work consistently over the week. The other coursework assessment is the team presentation, which is also weighted at 30%. And it's now available. The submission deadline is the 14th of November for the presentation file. So bear in mind that there's two main submission points, if you like. One is the actual presentation file that your team is going to use, and the other is the actual presentation. So you need to submit your presentation file by the 14th of November, but your presentation will happen over the next 3 weeks, over the subsequent 3 weeks after the 14th. And it will happen in the timetable, your timetabled lectorial slot. And once the submissions have been made, we'll be clear about exactly when your time slot will be. So what the task for your team is to answer the question of all the technological developments going on right now, what concerns your team the most, and then why. And so the only interest we have in your choice of technological development is that it gives you enough scope to do really well on the assignment. And so for that reason, as much as anything else, you're expected to discuss your idea with a member of the teaching team in lectorials beginning week the 3rd of November. So we'll assemble teams, and we'll ask about you'll have an opportunity to talk about the idea that you have. What issue, what technological development are you going to pick? There are lamentably many possibilities, so it's really up to you to decide what motivates you the most, what you feel is the most concern. And so really, because you're in a team, you're going to have to discuss what the issue you want to look at is. And so as a team, you're going to have to figure out, particularly when you have more than one different possible topic. So you might have two team members who want to look at bias in AI systems for financial services, as an example. You might have someone else who's worried about autonomous weapons, and then someone else might be more worried about the autonomy of cars, autonomous vehicles, for example. So that team has lots of good ideas. They just have to kind of figure out which one they're going to focus on. And when you've done that, then you will, in order to answer that question, why, you're going to identify one ethical issue, one legal issue, and one professional issue. And the professional issue will be based on the BCS or ACM codes of conduct. And these must apply to your technological development or technology. So a key thing for you to do in your analysis is make sure that whatever you're arguing, whatever points you're making, are clearly linked to the issue or the technological development that you are focusing on. So it's no use sort of folks saying, well, we're really, really worried about AI bias in financial services, and then doing a general thing on the AI bias, you've got to be specific to your concern. And the presentation has, this is all in the assignment briefing. I'm just going through it here, just and then introducing any questions. But just to highlight the first point, the introduction, including the critical reflection on how and why you selected the topic you are presenting, is why it's really important that this is something meaningful to you, your team. And if your team has, negotiated which topic they're going to pick, then that's a really useful thing to put in the introduction. Your critical reflection is, well, how did you decide on your topic? And it would be unusual if a team just straight up said, well, we're going to do this then. There needs to be some criticality to your approach. I would be surprised, if 10 people sat down together and came up with exactly the same technological development going on right now that worries them. And that's good. That's a good starting point. You wouldn't expect your team to have the same idea to begin with. Then you negotiate, then you figure out, and then that's why that goes into your critical reflection. How did we choose this topic? I won't dwell on the analysis of the ethical, legal, and professional issues. We're doing that a lot in the lectorials, and so that should be almost second nature to you. The critical reflection on the work conducted is, how did it go? How did your work go as a team? What were the difficult bits? What were the positive bits? What would you do differently next time? Those kind of questions. And it's obviously a group assignment. So like I said, you have 10 members of a team, and they must come from the same lectorial as you. All teams must come from the same lectorial, because then you're going to be giving your presentation in your timetabled lectorial. Okay, and just one last thing to note, that once your presentation has been, you've been given your time slot for your presentation, then that is an assessment point as well. So you've already submitted your presentation file, but then you'll be given a presentation slot, for example, in the second week in your lectorial in the second week, you're the third team presenting. That is now your assessment point. And so the only way you can change that is through the standard university procedures, like exceptional circumstances and so on. Okay, so the individual test, the briefing is available, and this is basically it. It's an objective test. The weighting is 40%. And it's an objective test, which means it's going to be multiple choice and multiple response questions. And for most, for those students who have study needs agreement, not all of this will apply. You'll have specific adjustments to your tests. But as a general starting point, the test will require that you can only answer the question and then go to the next question until you complete. You can't skip backwards or skip forwards during the test. You will have 40 questions to be answered in 45 minutes, and the test will automatically submit after 45 minutes or the end of the test window. So the tests themselves will happen in the week beginning the 12th of January, and we will be careful to make sure that you're not clashing with exams, for example. So we'll be allocating slots. And like I said, for the same thing for the team assignment, like I said, once you've been given a time slot, that's an assessment point. You can only change it with exceptional circumstances request, and then you can only defer. So that will be arranged nearer the time, but you will have plenty of notice as to which time slot you're going to be set to. The scope of the test is all units. So, anything that comes up in the units can come up in the test. It doesn't mean that you're going to be asked questions about every single unit necessarily, but the scope of the test is everything in the units. And just to note, the test is closed book, so you're not allowed to bring in any resources. we use lockdown browser, so you won't have access to Canvas or the web or anything like that, and the test will be invigilated. So it's test conditions basically. So you must arrive on time, and you must follow the instructions and the provided to you. That bit's quite standard. I think that would be very familiar. And that's back to the survey. But I just want to stop for questions. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording.